Anytime I talk to Simeon, I feel like I'm kind of changing gears a little bit. Simeon Hein. I've met him at the conferences for the Society for Scientific Exploration. He has a great deal of information on topics that I seldom come into contact with. He's a PhD in sociology, and he's been studying encounter phenomena and similar type of phenomena that I hope he's going to tell us a little bit more about today. So, without going into any more details, thanks for coming, Simeon. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks a lot, John, and thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to the SSE and the PA. This has been really fascinating day so far. I've really enjoyed these presentations. And I want to give you a little perspective. I'm a sociologist. That's what my PhD is in. I used to teach statistics before I got involved in some of these topics. I was at Washington State University. And I want to show you how a sociologist looks at some of these topics, because those of us that have been involved with statistics and research methods, we're concerned if we're actually getting accurate data that we're looking at, that we're making sense of. We often see people do statistical analyses and model representative of the entire population. So we're going to get into that now with topics about UFO encounters, other types of encounters, and UFO abductions to see what we can learn here. Now, my interest in this subject matter more recently actually came out of learning remote viewing. This is something that I learned about in 1996, and I heard Courtney Brown, who has been part of the SSE in the past, he was talking about it on my local radio station. I had just finished being in university at WSU up in Washington State. And I really thought remote viewing, I mean, Courtney was saying that other people could do it. Anyone could do it. You didn't have to be special. So I thought, this is really interesting. This is something that could really change my worldview. If it's real, this would have an impact on how we look at reality. But I was also skeptical. It's not a bad thing to be skeptical. I sort of wanted to go as an open-minded skeptic. I was open to it being real. Remote viewing, which Paul Smith is going to talk about later on in the afternoon. The ability to acquire information from things at a distance, people, places, and events that could be far away from you, and that you could acquire this data. I learned the system that Courtney taught, which was based on Ingo Swann, who I was able to meet a few times before he passed on in 2013. He was at the IRVA conferences, and the IRVA and SSE have held meetings together in the past. I learned the CRV system, and I also learned it later on from another person who had been in the military viewing unit, which Paul Smith will talk about, from Lynn Buchanan. And it was really the same thing. It's a written system that shows you how to stop editing your thoughts and sort of spontaneously write down impressions you get without doing what we normally do, which is try to make sense of things, right? So I really found that it worked. And I was surprised to find how accurate it could be, that even a beginner like myself within a day or two was getting accurate results. And so were everyone else in the class. After a few days, you'd really get these very accurate drawings of pictures that were hidden in folders, and you couldn't see them ahead of time. The monitor might know what these are, but this can even be done double blind, so no one knows what the target is, and you still get the same level of accuracy. So what happens in remote viewing sometimes is, this is before Ingo later went on to work at SRI with Hal Puthoff on the left and Russell Targ on the right, who've also been associated with SSE and IRVA. And what often happens is you get groups of people together. Like, this is one of our classes we've had in Boulder in the past. I've taught remote viewing for quite a while since I learned it, because I found that people found it was really valuable to them to learn that they had additional abilities. Like I thought originally I couldn't do it, that anyone really had some ability to do this, and some people were quite good at it. You have groups of people, and what happens when you get groups of people together, they begin to share stories over lunch breaks, and people who attend these sorts of training often have very interesting experiences of their own. While I was at Farsight back in 1996, I encountered two people who had worked for NASA who told me a lot of things I had never really heard before. Now, I have to be honest, I did have a UFO sighting with my mom in the Everglades when I was like 11 or 12. It was something overhead that we couldn't describe. And at first it was still, then it moved. And when we went to the ranger talk that night in the Everglades, the ranger said, "Did anyone see anything interesting today?" So my mom raised her hand bravely and said, "We saw a UFO." And then she said her next statement was, the ranger said, "Did anyone else see anything interesting?" So even back then in my 11, 12-year-old mind, I was kind of wondering why the park ranger didn't want to talk about what we had seen. I didn't know much about the topic being that young, but we had seen something that my mom was sure was a UFO. In any case, at Farsight, I encountered a gentleman that worked transcribing NASA film, 16mm film, to a device he had made that could turn it into video. And he told me he could easily see structures on the moon in many of the NASA videos that the public had never been seen. I also ran into a former shuttle astronaut there, a civilian astronaut, someone who actually hadn't left the Earth, but was one of the people they trained to be on the shuttle missions. And he had told me about triangular UFOs and how these were part of the U.S. military arsenal, but they had been reverse engineered from real extraterrestrial vehicles. So this sort of got my curiosity going, not to mention that occasionally we viewed UFOs towards the end of the training. After we could view, basic verifiable targets, we would occasionally do a UFO. Now, it's interesting to note that one of the people that got remote viewing together in the beginning, who got the whole thing started, was Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. He later became a real advocate for ET disclosure. And he was with Russell Targ, James Fletcher, and Werner von Braun, the Nazi aerospace engineer that was brought over to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, when a lot of Nazi scientists were brought over post-World War II to the United States to work in places like Los Alamos and other areas so we could have their expertise. And it was Edgar Mitchell and Werner von Braun that really pressed James Fletcher to start funding for this. I mean, it was Werner von Braun, according to Russell, who said right there, "Oh, come on, James, my grandmother was psychic. You should put some resources into this. It could be important." So that's how the actual SRI program got going. It started with Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell later became a real advocate for ET disclosure. He always told us, and I talked to him personally after one of the conferences in the late 90s where I saw him, he always said he had never seen anything. He hadn't had an encounter experience directly with a UFO, but that he had talked to many astronauts who had seen something from the Apollo craft and so forth, and he was certain it was a real phenomena. And he got a lot of witnesses to come forward into Steve Greer's disclosure project, which made its public appearance in 2001. So how do we talk about topics that are not easy to discuss? Ron Westrom has done a very good job presenting this. Those of us at the SSE in the past, he's done a very good job presenting this to us. And you can find his presentation, I think, on the SSE site. It's well worth looking at. He calls these sorts of phenomena that are widely experienced but little talked about hidden events. And he made this comparison between UFO phenomena, which we're hearing a lot about in the news recently, and hidden events. He connected it to child abuse because he told us, and this was really interesting to learn, and you can do the research on your own to find that it's true. Initially,